Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Live Without Training Wheels show. I'm your host, Lynna Sutherland, owner and author of Homeschooling Without Training Wheels and mother of 8 great kiddos, ages teen to toddler. And tonight we have a special gathering of the Large Family Homeschooling Circle. So this video is being privately recorded, and invitations were issued only to those who are members of the Large Family Homeschooling Circle. But eventually this video will be on YouTube. And then on down the road, it will also be a podcast episode in the Live Without Training Wheels podcast lineup. So if you are a member of the Large Family Homeschooling Circle, I want you especially to get in the habit of registering for the live events that we have here at Crowdcast, not just RSVPing in the circle, but coming through to Crowdcast and registering for 2 reasons. One, as I said before, these events are private. You can't find links to them anywhere else. So you want to get in the habit of coming here and registering. And once you're registered, you'll receive a reminder email to join the event just a couple of moments before the event starts, about 10 minutes before it begins. And that way you'll have the opportunity to click that personalized link in that email. And if you click the link in that email from Crowdcast, it'll give you permission to get right into the event, even if you signed up on a computer and now you're joining from a tablet or a phone or something. As long as you click that personalized link, you'll automatically be logged into the event that you registered for. And then the other reason that you want to register is because if you look over in the left-hand menu on Crowdcast, there's a link that says joined events. And don't click there now because you want to stay here and watch the video. But if you click the link that says joined events, then it will take you to anything you've ever registered for before. So it's really just kind of a great way to collect it. Like even if you know that you can't attend ahead of time, even if you say, oh, I'm busy that night, my kids have soccer practice, go ahead and register anyway. And that way you don't have to hunt around and search to find for the link when you want to watch the replay later on, because it'll be right there in your joined events. It's even more important when you're watching a private event, because you won't be able to look back at past events on my main page. It won't be listed there because you've received a special invitation to an event that's not available to the general public. So those are just a few little housekeeping details. And the other one, as usual with a Crowdcast event, there's an Ask a Question button down at the bottom. I love this feature of Crowdcast. If you've got a question anywhere throughout the presentation, go ahead and click the Ask a Question button and put in your question. Of course, you're free to, at any time, chat in the chat bar on the side. I love interacting all throughout the discussion, so don't feel like you're interrupting. But if you've got a question and you put it in there, then when I get to the Q&A section at the end, I can click a little button to timestamp as I'm answering questions. So that also means if you're watching on the replay, you can click the Ask a Question button, and you can click the buttons next to those questions to jump right to the answers of those questions if you want to see what has been discussed or what questions have been answered at the end. So housekeeping details out of the way, let's hop right in. And tonight we're talking about managing multiple ages, or managing a multi-age homeschool. First, before we get into the meat and potatoes of the talk, and I've got some ideas for you and some strategies, but before we get there, we need to lay a little bit of groundwork, and we need to think about this really realistically, what it is we're doing. And I really think that the first step in wisely managing a multi-age homeschool is just to embrace what it is that we're doing. If we are homeschooling large families, we are going to bang our heads against a brick wall and drive ourselves crazy if we keep trying to fit our large family into a small family mold. And I've talked about this before. I discussed it this summer when we were doing the large family homeschool planning group. But it's really important. We need to really it's not just, give up on trying to follow all those planning tips and all those scheduling tips that smaller families use. But it's more than that. It's really to embrace what's beautiful about a large family and to understand that, no, our children's homeschool might not look like what another family's look like. And there are things that they will miss, but then there are also things that they will gain and blessings that they will receive from being a part of a large family. And also to remember that, this isn't an accident. This isn't, whoops, I got myself in over my head and now my kids are going to suffer. And what was I thinking? Because I don't know. I won't put words in your mouth, but I struggle with that some days, that feeling of like, what did I do to my kids? What did I do to myself? What was I thinking? But, God is completely in control of our families and how they look and who is added to our family and the particular challenges that come along at particular times and how much energy we have, all of those things. God is completely in control. And your family is not going to look like another family, even another large family, right? Because we all have a whole variety of factors that go into making up the very unique and particular dynamics of our own family. Maybe there are some long-term health concerns. Maybe there are learning disabilities or learning challenges. There are all kinds of things that could be factors that shape uniquely what your homeschool looks like. And that's actually a good thing, right? God is using your home as a place to raise up your children in the way that he wants them to be shaped. And he chose every detail specifically. He chose, the family that they'd be born into, the mom, dad that they have, the siblings, all of that. And so even though we can really be frustrated some days, and it's totally understandable to be frustrated when, we're trying to manage all these different ages, all of these people whose needs we want to meet, and to feel, discouraged or frustrated about doing that, it really is helpful to me to be reminded that, none of this is outside of God's control or outside of his plan for how our family would grow and develop. Also, another way in which I frequently see moms of large families, just getting a little off track is failing to take you, the mom, into consideration. And I know that, there's so much talk out there about self-care and, and sometimes we think like, oh yeah, well, I don't have time to spend all day at a spa and get a pedicure and take up golfing and whatever. But, and of course, different families have different budgets, different time allowances, different hobbies, different whatever. But, what I'm talking about here really is just considering who you really are as a person in terms of your strengths and your weaknesses and your gifts and what you like and what you don't like. And sometimes we plan for the ideal. It would be ideal if I had the energy to homeschool everybody back to back for 8 hours straight, but you didn't have that yesterday. And it's unlikely that you're going to have that tomorrow. So instead of planning for, this theoretical potential, maybe someday I'll be there, plan for, the reality of where you really are, knowing that, this coming year is probably going to look a lot like last year, and tomorrow is probably going to look a lot like yesterday did. It doesn't mean that we're giving up. It doesn't mean that we don't want to grow, but it means that we are learning what our own personal limitations are and making decisions accordingly. God designed you uniquely. He designed you to have the gifts and the strengths and the weaknesses and the struggles and the interests and the personality that you have. And so as we grow into ourselves and as we understand more about how God has made us to be, he doesn't intend for those discoveries to bring us shame. He intends for us to use what we've learned to make better use of what he's given us, right? And so, when you admit that you're finite and you say, you know what, I don't have infinite energy. I don't have infinite time. When you admit that you're finite, you're not giving up. You're not disappointing to God. As a matter of fact, to admit what's true is honoring to God. You're acknowledging, God, you're divine. You are infinite. I'm not infinite. I'm finite. You're God. I'm a human being. That isn't slacking and, giving in. That is acknowledging your place and how God has created you to be. So with that groundwork behind us, or underneath us, I guess you'd say, with that framework in mind, let's move forward. And I just want to set up a real simple idea for you here. I want you to imagine that you are in charge of mixing the sound on a recording. Now, it's kind of a bad analogy for me to choose in that I don't really know a lot about sound mixing, but what I do know is I have this visual image in my mind of a board that has all of these little sliders on it, right? And each one can be, you can slide each one up or down a little bit. And so somebody who's managing the audio for a recording or for, a presentation or something might be sliding some little sliders, whatever you call them, dials, sliding some meters up and some down, and adjusting and tweaking as he goes, all these little sliders to adjust everything optimally for the whole picture to work together, the whole audio picture to work together as well as it can. So I wanted to talk to us tonight, and I want to, definitely you guys engage with me in the discussion, but let's look at 5 areas that we can kind of, as it were, tweak or slide up and down with our children in a multi-age homeschool. And, as we said, each of us is unique. So where the slider lands on each of these categories for each of us is going to be different. But that's the beauty of this kind of, audio mixing slider kind of imagery, is that we have the ability to tweak, some higher, some lower, so that we're meeting the needs of the unique individuals in our family. So the first thing that we can think about is grade level. On the one far end of the spectrum, we can use grade levels as a guide, right? What do I need to teach this year? Well, let's look at what the 3rd grade math is supposed to include. Let's look at what 3rd grade handwriting is supposed to look like. We can use grade levels to essentially, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to spend hours out there on Google saying, hey, I need to make up my own 3rd grade math curriculum. I need to figure out my own 3rd grade math checklist. We can just say, nope, I'm just going to get a 3rd grade math workbook, and we're just going to work through whatever they say 3rd grade is supposed to be. On the far opposite end of the spectrum, we can let go of the idea of grade levels, and we can, just do things with multiple children, mixing together multiple ages, and, have that added freedom and flexibility. And so we see that on the one end, the advantage is that perhaps a lot of the work is done for us. And it's definitely helpful, people who've put thought into things, people who have preceded us in doing this work and putting thought into, what's developmentally appropriate for a 3rd grader, what's developmentally appropriate for a 2nd grader, for a 5th grader. That's helpful. It's nice that someone's already done some research and laid some groundwork there for us. So that can be useful. Perhaps your children have to take testing at the end of the year. Maybe they have to do some kind of standardized test. And so, well, how do I get them ready for a 3rd grade standardized test? Well, probably this 3rd grade math book is going to do the trick. So, on that end, we have advantages. But then on the other end, we have the advantage that we can recognize that in a homeschool, a lot of the reason that we have grade levels is to facilitate the necessary division of labor that needs to happen in any kind of traditional school setting. And I'm not trying to trash that setting. I'm just saying, if you're going to have, thousands of students in a school and you're going to divide them up roughly by age level, then there needs to be some agreement. We need to make sure that the 1st grade teacher teaches about fractions, and that the 2nd grade teacher covers halves and fourths and thirds and fifths, so that then the 3rd grade teacher can build on that and get into, more complex fractions. You have division of labor, and so you have to have some agreement about who's going to cover what. That's not necessarily the case in the homeschool. So in the homeschool, you can say, well, we're all going to do fractions down to this greater detail this year because I think all these kids can handle it, even though some are 3rd graders and some are 1st graders, and we can do it all together. Or, it's sometimes more scary to think about that in terms of math, but you can definitely do it in other subjects. Like, why does the 2nd grader have to learn about ancient Egypt and the 3rd grader learn about colonial times and the 5th grader learn about the history of your state when, everybody could just do colonial times all together? You don't have to do one in 2nd grade and one in 3rd grade and one in 5th grade. So, there's this sliding scale of to what extent is it helpful for us to use that framework of grade levels? And to what extent is it just kind of holding us back or imposing unnecessary boundaries on us that could be helpful if we lowered those walls and just did some more mixing or some more flexibility of grade levels and what's taught in each age. And so kind of an overflow of that idea, the next slider is pulling people all together for learning versus one-on-one. And so those are the two extremes, right? The two extremes would be every child is taught every subject one-on-one versus everybody learns everything all together in a whole group. I don't know any families who do either of those extremes. But if those are the two ends of the spectrum, then you can imagine that in the middle, there would be all kinds of wonderful options for just mixing and varying how you, how you interact with your kids and how you group them and what kind of how you group the subjects or the topics that you're teaching. And so, you could say, well, these 2 or 3 children are similar in age. And so we're going to do history all together with these 3, but these 3 are still going to each do their own math curriculum or their own, grade level, age level of math. Or perhaps you're going to do some one-on-one with the younger kids who are learning to read, but the older kids are going to be able to do their reading, together. Maybe you're going to read and discuss some piece of literature together. And so, definitely can save time if you're able to lump everybody together. Okay, let's just do history all together with these 3. However, if you're lumping people together, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but if you're grouping people together and working with them together, it can save time in one sense. Like, okay, I only have to teach this history lesson once, or I only have to teach one history lesson to these 3 instead of 3 separate history lessons. But if you've been homeschooling for any length of time, you also know that the more children you add together to a mix, you can have all kinds of things going on. First of all, the more people you add in, the more you have that kind of traditional classroom dynamic where there are a whole variety of levels or of, children at various places developmentally, educationally, mental maturity levels, present together in this group. And so are they all being equally benefited by what you're teaching? So maybe, you're having to teach kind of towards the middle, and the younger child is not going to quite catch on to everything you're saying. And the older child is going to spend more time learning than he would if you were talking to him one-on-one, because you have to go a little slower for the younger 2, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, if you were teaching each child independently, you would still have to do 3 separate history lessons, but you might save some time in the fact that they're not distracting each other. They're not kind of, maybe bickering with each other. I don't know. Does anybody else have that experience in their homeschools of children who are grouped together or sitting together at the same table bickering with each other and that causing a little bit of a delay in your homeschool? We definitely have that in our homeschool. So, you even if you're teaching the exact same history to all 3 children, you could meet individually with each child and go over the material or talk with them about what they've been reading or listen to their narration from, the history material that they've been reading. So that's an option too. Sometimes we think we have, we can either teach 3 different history subjects, or we can teach one history subject and do it all together. But remember, there's a middle option too. You could teach the same history subject. So you as a mom are only having to prepare for one, say you're going to teach colonial America. That's all you have to prepare for. That's all you have to get library books and resources for. But that doesn't preclude the options still of meeting individually with each of those children and, just going over their work with them separately. And I think another thing to keep in mind, we talked about how, sometimes grouping them all together means that there might be bickering or they might distract each other, or you might not be able to tailor your instructional level and pacing to each particular child. But another thing that I think is super important to keep in mind, and again, one of those ways where moms kind of sometimes forget to think about themselves, and that is mom's sensory overload, right? Because sometimes in a homeschool day, and this, I will say, I'm an extrovert. So I'm sure, my introvert mom friends could chime in on their experience with this. But I don't think that this is exclusively an introvert thing because, as a mom, even as an extrovert mom, I get so peopled out pretty quickly during the day. Like by 11 o'clock, I just kind of want to go hide in my room because I've just done people things after people things after people things. And it's not necessarily the upbuilding, like filling of my tank, people kinds of things as if I was having an engaging discussion with my husband or another adult. And so sometimes I find that meeting with a bunch of children all together and doing crowd control, it contributes more to my sensory overload than talking one-on-one with one of my kids. And I feel like sometimes, there's no magic bullet for this, but I do feel like sometimes when I gather the kids in a group and some of them are kind of grumpy, like, I don't want to do this. This is stupid. I'm not interested. That seems to be reduced a little bit when I'm talking with one child. And I'm not sure why that is. I'm not sure if the grumpy attitude that they're putting on is, to show the other kids that they're too cool for this. And then that becomes kind of irrelevant when they're just one-on-one with you. Or maybe if it's just the blessing, the benefit of having time one-on-one with you that kind of lowers some of the barriers or the walls that they might put up if this was more of a public, quote unquote, public group event with other siblings. But I think all of those things are worth taking into consideration. And I would even say, as a mom, keep in mind as you're going through your homeschool day, or even as you're laying in bed the night before, kind of visualizing your next homeschool day, where are the parts of the day where you go, I don't want to do this anymore. This is so overwhelming. This is so discouraging. I don't like homeschooling. And I mean, sometimes it's just one of those days and it's like the whole day, I don't like homeschooling. But, we can troubleshoot by saying, like, why do I hate it when we do morning time? Like, what is it that just completely drives me batty about morning time? Or why do I dread, the handwriting lesson? And if you feel like it's sensory overload, then it might be worth it to see if you can meet individually or even, put them on a loop. Like, can you meet, this day of the week, you meet with this one and give them some stuff they can do on their own during the week. And then the next day you meet with this one and give them some stuff they can do on their own. So, like I said, this is a slider, but it's one you can play with and you can tweak it up and down. And, it's one that you can play with during the year with not too much repercussion. And, you don't have to like flip the whole schedule. So let's say you have this slot of time where you're meeting with 3 people to do history together. And it's just really kicking you in the rear end in terms of like energy and sensory overload. Well, just try taking that time and splitting it up either within that time segment or like on a rotating basis, like looping through the kids or something like that, and meeting with each one-on-one and see if that makes a difference to your energy level, your sensory overload, and all that. Let's see. All right. So another slider on the scale is keeping it simple versus following interests. And these are not necessarily like opposites or opposite ends of the spectrum, but I think once I flesh it out a little bit, you'll see what I'm talking about. So first of all, I know that it's a struggle for every homeschool mom to keep the school day simple because, people who are homeschooling their children are by definition people who have big ideas about what an education should look like. That's why we're homeschooling. That's why we're taking the time and energy to do this, is because we have thoughts about what an education should look like. And for the most part, we have overactive imaginations, right? Like we have, our imaginations are bigger than our scheduling books, kind of like your eyes can be bigger than your stomach, while our, educational philosophy is bigger than our day planner books, because we can dream up a bajillion things that would be just fabulous to do in the homeschool. And we have to constantly keep reining ourselves back in and, going back to like, okay, what's actually necessary? And I'm not saying that we just shoot for, the lowest common denominator in our homeschools, or that we make our homeschools just as, bottom line, bare level as we can do it. But, we do have to remind ourselves like, okay, look, this is all that's actually required. Keep it really simple. And, there was has Has anybody ever heard of Amy Decision? Her last name is not spelled decision like the English word decision. It's like DAZYC. I don't know. It's a probably an Eastern European name. But anyway, she wrote the Tightwad Gazette for years and years. And she, one of the things she says about saving money is that there's two main ways to save money. One is to do the same things you've always done, but find cheaper ways to do them. So like find really cheap ways to go on a cruise, or find really cheap ways to, whatever it is, have a gym membership or whatever. Another way to save money is just to not do some of those things that you used to do. And so I think the same thing is true of homeschooling. When we think about managing a homeschool schedule and fitting things into a homeschool schedule, we often think of strategy one. Okay, give me some tips for how to do all the things I'm already doing, but quicker and more efficiently. And that's definitely a conversation that's worth having, because sometimes we unknowingly are wasting time, or we're not doing things efficiently, and we could kind of tweak our methods or whatever. And that's some of what we're talking about tonight. But sometimes I think we have to come to face the fact that there's only so much time you can save, and there's only so much more, efficiency that can be gained with doing the things you're already doing. And sometimes, if you really are desperate for more margins in your schedule, more simplicity in your day, then the strategies you're looking for are not strategies for how to do the same things more efficiently. But you're going to need to be honest with yourself about what things can be cut. What things are lovely but not essential, and you need to pull them back. And then, as I said when I started this topic, on one end of the spectrum is, the super simple schedule. On the other end of the spectrum is following interests. The reason I put those two things across from each other is that sometimes the things that are not the, bare minimum, basic, essential, must-do things are the things that really kind of engage our kids and that spark imagination and that draw them in. And, this is one of the reasons that morning time has been such a big hit, because, we probably wouldn't say, or maybe you would say, but I think a lot of moms probably wouldn't say that, oh yes, poetry memorization is just one of the basic essentials that you must have in homeschooling. I think if we're being driven by the must-haves, it's probably like, they've got to get the math done because that has to be done on the standardized test, and they need to know how to read and write and spell. But the things that we might weed out would be those things that actually are what add delight and joy to our homeschool, for both for us and for our children. And so while we definitely want to simplify, and we definitely want to be realistic about our time and not overload ourselves and not, give ourselves grief about not doing all these things that are just, they're nice, but they're not required. We also want to keep in mind, that no kid and no mom wants to slog through day after day after day of things that we're just doing because we have to. Things that we're only doing them because this is what we're required to do. And I'm not saying that you can't, enjoy math or enjoy the read alouds or enjoy the, writing activities that you're doing or whatever. Certainly wise to have strategies for engaging your kids in those subjects. But sometimes those quote unquote extras, the art, the music, the nature studies and the journaling and the journal sketches in a nature journaling book or something like that. Those are the things that we as moms can really look forward to, and or our kids are really looking forward to. And so, sometimes adding in those things, and again, this is one of those areas where we tend to be really good at making sacrifices and just putting our nose to the grindstone when it comes to including things that our children are interested in, things that our children really want to do, but not as good at making sure that we include things that we want to include, things that make us think, oh, I can't wait until we get to this part of the homeschool day. I can't wait until I get to share with them about this, or until we get to have a conversation about that. And so I think that's equally as important. I mean, it's important to encourage our children and to provide things that are of interest to them and are engaging to them, but it's also of benefit to our children for mom to be rejuvenated and engaged and excited about the things she's teaching. I was doing a writing lesson with my children today, and we were brainstorming topics for something they're going to write about next week. And one of the things I said to them is, you can put pretty much anything you want to put on this list, but the one guideline is I want you to write things that, I want you to list things that are of interest to you. Because if you put something down that's not of interest to you, it is really, really hard to write in an interesting way about something in which you are not interested at all. You don't necessarily have to know everything that there is to know about that subject, or even to know everything that you're going to write about that subject, because you can always research. You can always watch a YouTube video, read a book, gather more information. Researching is a part of good writing. But if it doesn't interest you at all, it is going to be a pretty difficult stretch for you to engage your reader through your writing about something that you really could not care less about. And so the same thing is true with the homeschool mom. I know sometimes you have to teach something that you just, it just really does not light a fire underneath you. But if that's everything you're teaching all day long, every day, it is going to be really difficult to engage your kids. And so it's important that you include things during the homeschool day, or ways of teaching the things that you need to teach that really will engage you, that are of interest to you. And then that interest and enthusiasm can at least show up for your children, and probably also flow over to them as they're learning and engaging with you during the homeschool day. All right, our third slider, our third variable that we can tweak from one end to the other, is independent learning versus learning with mom. And we think of this especially with older kids, but this is, something that can begin quite young, depending on what activity it is that they're doing. And especially now that we have online options. So, even as young as second or third grade, sometimes children are doing things independently. And so this is one of those areas where, wow, it's so nice. It's such a great blessing and advantage that we have the opportunity to take advantage of, as I said, online things, or perhaps even workbooks or things that are a little bit more self-directing and children can work through them on their own. And so we're going to think about the factors that go into this, and which end of the spectrum would be most advantageous to us. And it's oftentimes kind of a kid by kid, subject by subject thought process or conversation. So on the one end of the spectrum, learning how to learning how to teach yourself something. I mean, that's one of the big goals of homeschooling, right? We say it's not so much that we want our kids to leave our homeschool with a whole collection of particular facts. It's more that we want them to leave our homeschool with the understanding that learning is a lifelong process. It's something that they will always be doing. And we want them to walk away with the confidence of, I can learn pretty much anything I want to learn. If I come across something and I need to learn how to do that, I know how to do that. I know how to find the resources, and I know how I learn best, and I know how I can, absorb that information and make use of it in a way that it will stick and I can understand it, right? So teaching our children to learn independently it's not just like a strategy. It's kind of in one way an end goal of homeschooling, of our homeschool. So there's definitely that piece that, that's a skill that we want to teach them. But on the other hand, when we're talking about managing our homeschool day and, we've got multiple ages, multiple kids who need us, it definitely can be something where we think, okay, if this child could become more independent on this subject, then I'd have more time to work with these other kids. And here's where the slider piece comes in, because we kind of assume in our heads, okay, if I can slide this child towards independence, that will save me time. But there are all kinds of variables that come into play when a child is working more independently. For example, I've noticed this myself. When my kids are doing things more independently, all of a sudden, I'm not learning what they're learning as they're learning it, right? So when I'm reading aloud the history to everybody, then I know what they're learning, not because I did pre-reading or because I, looked at the notes ahead of time or anything, but because I'm learning it at the same time when they're learning it. Whereas when they're learning off on their own, they come to me with a question. I'm like, I don't know. I haven't been watching the geometry lessons along with you. So I don't know, let me go watch the geometry lessons and then we'll figure out what it is you're supposed to be learning. And then I'll see if I can explain to you in a way different than the video explained it to you. So, again, if you find yourself constantly having to redo things that your children were doing independently, that might be a situation where it's a time saver for you actually to do it together, because then you don't have to go separately and teach it to yourself so you can teach it to your child. You just do it all together in one setting. Or, if you find that, oh, okay, well, they were supposedly independent, but, the learning wasn't actually happening, or they thought that they were grasping it, but they weren't, or we thought that they were learning this material and then they had a test or some kind of, oral narration or something, and it became apparent that they're really not grasping it. It doesn't necessarily have to be a character issue. It could just be, their perception of what they were absorbing, or your perception of what they were absorbing wasn't an accurate perception. And so, we can slide the slider of, when is it helpful for them to learn with us? And when is it helpful for them to grow and to be more independent in what they're learning? Because, as I said before, independent learning is one of our main goals of homeschooling, but so is regular and personal engagement with our children, right? If they were in a different school setting, they'd be doing all of their learning independently of us for the most part. And maybe we'd help a little bit with homework, but they'd be doing all of their learning independently. And so one of the reasons that we homeschool is that we want to be more involved in their education, not just choosing the curriculum and making the assignments, but involved in talking with them about what they're learning. So both teaching them to learn independently and engaging with them on what they're learning are not just, strategies or methods of getting homeschool work done. They're integral parts of the whole philosophy and purpose of homeschooling. So sliding up and down that scale is also a good way to tweak and adapt your homeschool day and how you manage different ages and stages. And then the final one, and I've alluded to this a couple times in different other topics that we've discussed, the final one is tests or graded assignments versus assessing through discussion or other oral assessments like oral narration or something like that. So, one of the things that I often tell moms who are coming out of, especially like if their children have been in a traditional school setting and they've pulled the kids out and they're homeschooling now and they're going through that process that we often refer to as deschooling, they're kind of trying to realize what it means to be a homeschool family and how that can look different than what they're used to seeing in a traditional school setting and what most of us grew up with in a traditional school setting. And so one of the things I often tell moms is that, there's a reason, just like there's a reason in the classroom why we have grade levels. There's a division of labor. There's a need to have an agreement about who's going to teach what so we don't overlap and then skip things. Well, the same thing is true with graded material and tests and things like that. If I'm teaching a class of 25 students, there's no way that I can have adequate individual conversations with everyone to the level that I really get a sense of who knows what. I might have a passing conversation with 2 or 3, but I'm not going to be able to talk with all 25, even if I'm answering questions, if they're answering questions in class. I'm going to call on a handful of the students and probably the same students frequently, but I'm not really going to get a good feel just, anecdotally and through oral discussion about what everybody learns. And there's also a communication piece that's involved. So it's not just about me, the teacher, understanding where everybody is in their learning so that I can help those who need more assistance or provide extra challenges or resources to those who are a little ahead. It's also about communicating. So I need to be able to communicate with the parents. I need to be able to communicate with, the principal or the school. I need to be able to communicate with next year's teacher so they'll have an idea about where this student is, what they've covered, what they've mastered, what still needs to be done. So it's not just that I can't talk to everybody. It's also that I have to let all of these other groups of people know what's going on. And it would be really way too cumbersome for me to just be sharing a lot of anecdotal stories. Oh, I had this great conversation with Billy. We talked about how, levers and wedges work and how they can work together. And I really got a sense that he understands. You can't have conversations like that with 25 children's parents and with the principal or the school about all the children and about, next year's teacher with everything that they're learning. And so graded materials that are averaged and papers that are sent home with grades on them are a necessary way to communicate with families about what kids are learning, right? Well, in the homeschool, you can talk to all of your children and you can adequately assess them through oral discussion. You don't need to communicate with the parents because you are the parent, and you can always talk with your husband about, how the kids are doing. There's not a school system. You might have to take some kind of assessment or something at the end of the year, but depending on your state, now there may be states that require grades, but a lot of times all that's really required for, say, a portfolio is a sampling, a collection. Here's a writing sample from the beginning of the year, writing sample from the middle, writing sample from the end. And so it really takes the pressure off when you expect, like I did, when I taught in a classroom, I taught reading and math and science and social studies every single day. And pretty much every single day, I had to have a piece of paper that I could grade for every one of those subjects because I had to have a certain number of grades per term to average together. That is just not the case in the homeschool. So we have a huge amount of flexibility there. We can do so much more just by discussion, just by interacting and talking. And, that human connection often does a much better job of really assessing what the children know. Like if they, are taking a test and they circled D instead of A, was it because they didn't know it? Or was it because, they're thinking about this in 300 different ways and, coming around to it from a completely different angle. And that's why the test looks wrong, but really they know a lot more than they're able to show on the test, right? So we definitely can appreciate that end of the angle. But on the other hand, just like we want to teach our children to learn independently, test-taking skills may be something that we want to teach our children, or not necessarily even just test-taking skills, but how to assess what they know, right? So when I was student teaching, I student taught in Latin. And what I saw over and over and over with kids who were taking Latin in middle school and high school, especially in middle school, was I would have moms come to me and say, my child is a straight A student. He's always gotten A's in everything. And now he's failing Latin. I don't understand how this is happening. And I said, you know what? This is so typical because I see kids who have done well in school before kind of fall flat on their faces in Latin because they're used to being able to just kind of listen in class, basically pay attention, basically do the homework, and then they sit down and they take the quiz and it's fine. And they, can basically figure it out or remember it from just listening in class or whatever. But when you get to Latin, you have to memorize things. You have to memorize vocabulary words. You have to memorize endings. And I'm sure that teachers of other languages would experience the same thing, but my experience was with Latin. And, so Latin was the first subject where they had to learn how to study. They had to learn not only how to memorize things, but how to assess themselves. Because, how many times have you as a student looked over a study guide or looked over a list of vocabulary words or whatever it was and said, yeah, I think I know those. And then you sit down on the test and it's like, yeah, I don't know those. And so, not just how to study, but how to check yourself and have a realistic assessment personally of what you know. So those are really good skills to have and really worthwhile things to put energy into, even if you're the mom and you're the principal and you're the next year's teacher. Those are still good skills to work on with your kids. And, it goes hand in hand with the lifelong learning, teaching them to be lifelong learners, teaching them to assess their own understanding is part and parcel of that. And I just want to share an idea that I really love that a member of our large family homeschooling circle shared. And she said that, she was finding herself, like I'm sure we've all found ourselves at a certain point with all of this backlog of stuff that needed to be graded, right? So if she had older children who were doing things that she had to check, then, she'd stay up late doing all this checking, or she'd do checking and then she'd realize like, oh, they forgot to answer this one and this one. And or I'm not sure what this answer means, so I'll have to ask them about it later. So it's just kind of messy, and it became this, she would get behind on it and there would be this backlog of things. And so she switched to a process of grading things with the child. So, maybe on Tuesday, they'd have an assignment, they'd turn it into her. And then when she met with them on Wednesday, they would grade it together. So she'd read out the answers, they'd check off things on their paper. And then if there was anything that they, skipped over or, they got it wrong, they could just talk about it right there and they could have a discussion honed in on the specific things that they missed. There was no backlog of paper. And the assessment wasn't something, this is kind of like this weird mindset that I have, and maybe it's a holdover from being a public school teacher, but I always think of grading papers as something you have to kind of do in secret. Like, you don't want anyone to see the answer key, and you don't want anyone to see anyone else's grades. And so you have to hide, and you have to grade the papers, and you don't let anyone see you doing the grading of the papers. But, she's understanding that what she's doing is not just assigning a grade from on high, but she is communicating with the student and, interacting with the student about what they understood and what they didn't understand. And if that's all you're doing, why not do the grading with the student? Why not work through it? And, and then they can have the opportunity to say, oh, well, I put this, but this is why I put it, or I put this because of that conversation we had the other day. And so I was thinking this was the same kind of thing, so you just get so much more information than just whatever's filled in on the paper, or whatever boxes are checked, or whatever on their test. And they get the opportunity to see how they're doing as they go through the test and what the answers ought to be, and to improve their ability then to learn or study or prepare for an assessment like that in the future. So those are just a few ideas that you can think about, these sliders. Do we use grade levels, or do we not use grade levels? Do we learn all together, or do we learn one-on-one? Do we keep it really simple, or do we add in those extra things that are often interesting and engaging? Do we teach the kids to work independently, or do we have them do things with mom? Do we have them take tests and written assignments that we grade, or do we assess by discussion, right? So all of those things are things you can slide up or down, things you can tweak, things you can adjust. And a lot of them are things that you can adjust slightly, or even more than slightly, during the course of a school year. They don't really require finding a whole new curriculum. They just require adjusting a little bit how you're using what you've already got on hand. So if you find yourself maybe in the slumps of winter, or it's spring and now everybody wants to be outside more, or just something new happens in the family and you need to make some adjustments, those are 5 areas where you can do some tweaking and some adjusting up and down to fit the needs of your particular, unique, individual family. So those are the things I had to share this evening. And if you've got any questions, I'd be more than happy to engage on those before we log off for the evening. All right, well, I don't see any, so I'm going to go ahead and log off. But the link to this will be in the Large Family Homeschooling Circle, so we can certainly continue the conversation there. And of course, if you're watching on the replay, absolutely feel free to follow up with more thoughts and comments there in the Large Family Homeschooling Circle. So thanks for joining me this evening, and I will see you next week. Next week, we're doing a live video for the whole Homeschooling Without Training Wheels network. And of course, you're invited to join us for that. And we'll be talking about homeschooling specifically with littles. So wrapping little people in, or how to manage the toddlers, the babies, the preschoolers that are alongside of us as we school the older children. So I look forward to seeing some of you there next week.